What can I say about Patricia Carroll? Well, she's a Passionist companion. That's the first thing. So she's a member of our Passionist companions in St. Patrick's Province. She's from Motherwell, which is in the Diocese of Motherwell. Those of you who speak Latin, the Latin name of the diocese is Fons Matris. So the Diocese of Fons Matris she's from. And she, I won't go through your whole life story, but she worked in the Archdiocese of Southwark for a number of years. Then she was director of Pastoral Resources, I think, was it?
Yeah.
You were, no, Episcopal delegate for Pastoral Resources in the Archdiocese of St Andrews in Edinburgh. And for a few years now, maybe about six years? Six years, she is the Director of Mission and Ministry for the Archdiocese of Dublin, which is a very big diocese, 200 parishes almost, and probably half the population of the Republic nearly, living in the Archdiocese of Dublin, and Patricia is the Director of Mission and Ministry. And a lot of that involves working with people in leadership roles, lay people and clergy in leadership roles, also training people. And I think you've only got about 5 courses running at the moment.
You've got a lot going on, yeah.
Yes. So she's a lot going on. She's also a member of the National Task Force for the Synod on Synodality in Ireland. So she's a member of the national group who are running the synod process in Ireland. She has various qualifications. She has a degree in theology. She has a license in catechetics from Paris. She has a master's in spirituality, which she did in the mysticism of Karl Rahner from Heathrop. And she even has a master's in canon law from Leuven. So she has lots of qualifications. But apart from all of that, and apart from having canon law qualifications, she's a very good person.
Quite busy.
And very committed. And is an example to me, because when I'm flagging and say I have too many things to do, I look at what Patricia's doing and I say, well, I don't have as much as she has to do. So thank you in your very heavy load that you have. And I know there have been bishops phoning you while you're here, annoying you about various crises and various dioceses in Ireland. But thank you for making time in your busy schedule to be with us this morning. Welcome, Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, it's good to be here. It's been a good experience so far, hasn't it? Paul Francis, you know, as usual, picks up the phone and asks you to do something, and it's very hard to say no, isn't it? And he said to me, you know, trying to tease out what he would like me to do this morning. So I said, just give me a kind of like steer. And he said, be practical. So that's what I'm trying to do this morning. And it's 2 sessions. And so we've been kind of doing a lot of philosophy and theology and spiritual reflection and so on. But this morning now we're going to try and ground it a wee bit in terms of the laity and what could the laity possibly do in this whole arena of contemplating the Passion, apart from individually contemplating the Passion. So this is, there's 2 aspects to this little section this morning. The first one is looking at the idea of prayer guides and developing prayer guides in different parishes or retreat places. Now, when we talk about prayer guide, we're not talking Ignatian. We're not talking you go off to an Ignatian course and you get trained and so on. So this is more basic and more simple. And in fact, during this week, we've been using that word simplicity all the time, haven't we? But we have to have something that kind of directs us towards a sense of when a person is asked or invited perhaps to do this, then what is it we're actually asking them to do? So I'm going to do a wee bit of focus in on a possible role description for a prayer guide, but it's inspired and formed by the new Directory for Catechesis 2020, which I'm sure you've all read. It came out during the pandemic, and it's a groundbreaking document. So we had a Directory for Catechesis from 1997, and as I say often when I go around and talk to parish groups and other groups, we're not in an era of change. And I usually do the pregnant pause, while they look at me and think, has she got wires coming out the top of her head? We're not in an era of change, we're in a change of era. And that's a different thing entirely. And of course, Francis said that in 2016 when he was speaking to catechists. We're in a change of era. And the change of era, we're nearly a quarter of the way through the 21st century. Did you notice that? Interesting, isn't it? So what actually fitted for the last century, even though it might have been exciting for us, might have been, like what we grew up with, it's not going to fit for now. So that's something that, parish communities and religious communities are living with and have to take on board. Okay, so role description, we're going to look at that a wee bit. We're also going to start to look at skills, simple skills that can be learned. And that would be the basis of starting to train parish prayer leaders. Right, so we'll move on. So what I'm suggesting is that any role for prayer guiding, whether it be in a parish setting or a Passionist setting or whatever, needs to be informed by something. And this is the something that we're going to unpack. So a prayer guide needs to be a witness. And the Directory for Catechesis talks about a catechist being a memory keeper. So we can think about that in terms of prayer guides too. There's also something about teaching when we guide in prayer. Now, I don't mean actually upfront teaching, but there's a learning experience for people when you draw them into something that is prayerful. And there's a very strange word there, mystagogue. When I was working in Scotland, we used to talk about Mr. Godgie. An accompaniment, that's a big one, accompanying people where they are and maybe moving them into a new space. And then finally, there is something about educating and drawing and leading out. Okay, so 6 aspects of a role, and we're going to unpack them now a bit. So I've been sitting, obviously, and I've been making notes and I've been listening, etc., during these past couple of days. And the bottom line is that anyone who's going to lead others in prayer needs to be able to say, I know the Lord. Just a bottom line statement. Otherwise, you're coming out of a place of theory. And we know that prayer is learned basically by praying. Prayer is learned by that kind of relationship that is real for us. So anyone who might be considering becoming a prayer leader or a prayer guide needs to be able to say with confidence and humility, obviously, I know the Lord. And the implication of that is that the person would be in touch with their own personal story of faith. They'll be able to tell what their journeying with the Lord has been so far. They'll be able to simply explain that. They'll they would be able to maybe draw others into that story and help others to identify their own story. And so this is where the quality of personal witness really impacts massively. And people know when we're the real deal. People know when we're just play acting, or the difference between that and being the authentic person. So quality of personal witness is really, really important. And it's out of that then that this ability to evoke personal response from participants can grow. And I've said this, I've said it about the role of the catechist, but I've changed it to prayer guide here. It's the role of the prayer guide to facilitate close encounters with Jesus. So for some, that's quite a big ask, really. You remember the film Close Encounters? Yeah? Close Encounters with Jesus. And if you look at the heading, A Witness of Faith, DC 113, all of this is flowing out of the Directory for Catechesis, paragraph 113. Okay, so that's kind of like the foundational thing that a person kind of needs to be in order to do this well. Here's the next one, and this was the description of a catechist, but I think it speaks very, very strongly to the Passionist charism, doesn't it? Yeah, keeping the memory alive. And so what does that mean? It's a really, really interesting phrase, keeping the memory of God alive, isn't it? And it does connect to the idea of pointing towards the living presence and action of God. Have you heard of Enzo Bianchi? Yeah. So Enzo Bianchi, anyway, he did a wee article, and it was around Memoria Dei, the memory of God. And it's a kind of ancient monastic concept. This is what this comes out of. Yeah. And in remembering God, God becomes present to us. So there's something around this in terms of our growing in an understanding of God's presence to us, enabling in what we do connections to the presence of God, and then ongoing experiences, not just one-off experiences, but kind of sustainable, ongoing experiences. And that connects very strongly to also enabling others to reflect, to wonder. That's kind of connection into contemplation, to pray and to celebrate, and kind of to notice the active presence of God at the centre of everyday life. And was it yesterday? Well, it was the word ordinary, common, everyday. It's kind of connecting in with that. And of course, this encounter that we're talking about is experiential and it's interpersonal. So in fact, then we have to get out of the way a bit. When we're guiding others, it's really not about us. We have to actually stand back a bit in order for people to experience God in their own particular way. So we're still on that paragraph 113 from the Directory for Catechesis. Okay. Then the idea of a teacher, of course, particularly in the Republic of Ireland, when we think teacher, we think classroom. And this is not that. It's not about class. It's really about learning from the ministry and the life of Jesus and gradually growing into learning the Jesus way of teaching, and he used lots of methods and very, very simple methods, and I think that that's definitely the Passionist flavour. The Passionist flavour is definitely about simplicity. He told stories, provoking reflection in life and context, and he was really fantastic at illustrating by example. And then he enacted how the kingdom is built, and obviously he taught his disciples to pray, and this is the key element of the role in terms of teaching, that we can learn to pray by saying prayers, we can learn to pray by imitating others, but there might be moments where we want to go deeper, and then we need someone to accompany and teach us, and that will come up in the next few slides. Okay. This is a strange word for many people, mystagogue, but it comes from the early church and the way that we initiated people into the Christian way of life. And the period of mystagogy after baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist was about the deepening of the Christian journey and a lifelong deepening of the Christian journey. So this speaks also, I think, very strongly to the whole notion of enabling a person to guide others, that we're trying to guide others into a deeper journey. We might sometimes be drawing others into the beginnings of a journey, but actually the bottom line with this journeying together is that we begin to feel and think and act like Jesus. Now that sounds like a big thing, doesn't it? But it's the Christian way of life. Okay, so it would be the task of then a person who's a prayer guide to enable that deepening in some regard. Not just inspiring for that Christian way of life, but calling for integration. Now, the word integration has come up. It came up yesterday a few times, you might have noticed. And it came up again in quite a lot of the writings of the mystics. Their journey is about integration. And this is one, I think, this last point that really, really speaks very strongly to the Passionist charism, that a faith that doesn't do justice is not yet mature. So when I'm training catechists, we've just started a big program about that. That's a shocking thing for a lot of adults to hear, that there's a relationship between just living and deepening your journey of faith and your prayer life, that there's an actual direct connection. But in fact, that really did connect for me when I was sitting listening, yesterday about the relationship between contemplation and action. So there's something there around that for Passionist prayer guides. And this one we're quite familiar with, this idea of accompaniment. And of course, it's a word now that is very in vogue, particularly since the publication of Amoris Laetitia. And actually it caused a lot of issues in the church because people were very unhappy with the idea that those who were in irregular relationships and so on would actually be accompanied by the church. But accompaniment is really what we're meant to be about in the church. But with regard to prayer guides then, this is what really matters, adapting to each person or group and being flexible in approach. That's difficult to do. I think particularly when you're learning to be a prayer guide, that you might think that you have to set up a specialised programme for each person that's sitting with you or being with you. So adapting to each person or group, really, really critical. And another part of this role then is growing in the ability to listen well. So being able to be quiet, to not overtalk, to not overshare as a prayer guide, to be comfortable with silence and so on, and give people space to breathe and to think. And then that big one about being led by the experiential questions of the one journeying. So for example, if you have decided as a prayer guide that you want to take people through a big long meditation on whatever, Mary at the crucifixion or whatever, but in fact the people in the group are more happy that just want to sit in quiet and silence, then you need to be led by the group. Another aspect of this accompaniment is the whole idea of developing prayer processes. See, we're very good at Catholics at formulas, aren't we? We're very good at that. Right, let's say in our Father, let's say a Glory Be, that's the prayer box ticked. Yeah. But prayer guides need to be able to, in fact, develop nice processes where they can imagine a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's easy, isn't it? A beginning, a middle, and an end. And then there is something about the continuity of the way that we are, rather than just having one-off moments. So we're really, really good at connecting ourselves in terms of like loads of energy being put into, so for example, a preparation period for a person, but we're not that good at the continuous week on week being with persons. We're not that good at that. Okay. So accompaniment. And then the idea of there's an educative process going on when we lead others in prayer. That might seem sophisticated, but it isn't really that sophisticated, because the educare route, is about drawing others and leading others. And so it's relating again to the way that Jesus relates to others and kind of mirroring that in some regard. So leading out and drawing out, again, it connects with that accompaniment where we've got a real ability to listen well, but also to enter fully into the dynamics of human growth. So I was really delighted on the first morning to hear that Paul of the Cross adapted what he was doing for children. That was great. That was really great to hear that. And this is connecting to that too. So what we need as a child or as a teenager, as a young person, as an older person, as an elderly person, those needs are different. Those needs are different. But getting back to perhaps thinking about methodology too, that when we look at Jesus, you see that he observed facts that everyone in the community is aware of. I think there's kind of some of those dialogues going on in some of the prayers of Paul of the Cross. He's moving his hearers to question, and then he begins a process of reflection. So that's a kind of dynamic, and maybe an outline of a beginning of a process that could be used. And the whole emphasis of this education is educating for discipleship. So when we're talking generally in parish, that's mostly what I work on. It's about an education for being a member of a believing, praying, celebrating, living community of faith. Now, is that might be the Passionist communities that we are connecting with too, the parishes that are Passionist, the retreat houses, and so on. So that's 6 aspects of a role that would be kind of filling out the beginning of a training for people that might feel that they want to lead others in prayerful experiences. So I'm not saying prayerful experiences, and that the key emphasis being on experience. Okay, right, that was probably a lot. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to buzz with each other and say what you think about that, how you feel about that. Is that interesting for you or whatever before we move on? Is that all right? 5 minutes. Yep. Yeah. Next one. Okay, so we're just going to move on. So those remarks really were quite general remarks that can fit into any kind of area. It's not just relating to something that's passionist. But just to move on then, if we were growing something out of these 6 aspects, here is something that might be a basic role description. And that's one of the things that we are doing in the Archdiocese of Dublin, to try and reinvent and renew and restore a lot of ministries. A lot of ministries died during the pandemic. People stood down and didn't return. But here's some of the kind of what I would call a very simple role description for somebody who might be a prayer guide. And we're not talking about a priest here. This is going to be mostly lay people that would do this. So, for example, coming out of that witness thing, we would hope that somebody who's with some training, obviously, with some training, would be able to share their experience of praying with the Passion and witness to how this is transformative for them. So there's the first thing. We would hope that by the end of a simple training process, the person would be able to do that. Or persons. That they have made a commitment to keeping the memory of the Passion alive. That otherwise it's not going to make much sense. And that they're able also to make good use of storytelling and also root this in the key passion narratives. Now, I mean, I think that the best Passionist preachers that I've come across are also great storytellers. You know, like Father Gus. Remember Father Gus? You know Father Gus in the Irish province, yes? And he was absolutely amazing at holding people and drawing them into a deeper place, very simply. So that's what we're talking about. And then enabling others to see the connection with the suffering and injustice in our world and the continuation of the Passion. So that's that mystagogue element of the role. Yeah. And then the ability to listen well, hold silences and lead into the reflection. That's the accompaniment element of the role. And with that then, like, okay, so imagine that these people come from heaven, from all corners of the different Passionist communities that we're in. Well, actually, I believe these people are in our communities anyway. They're there already. Yeah, they're there already. And then we start to think of like, well, what kind of skills does a person need? What kind of skills would a person get a good start with? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move on to that. So this was a program that was devised for parish prayer leaders. We started to do it just before the pandemic. We had devised in Dublin kind of 4 modules over a period of 4 months. So look, you're not going to wait for 5 years to train to do this. Yeah. 4 modules over 4 months. And we did some very helpful stuff in January and February of that year of the pandemic. Then the pandemic hit, bang, March. So we're only really coming back round to doing this again. Anyway, just going to talk you through this because I think this is the basis of beginning to helpfully skill people, or what they say out there in the big world out there, upskill people to do this, as St. Paul of the Cross would say, in the easiest possible way. I'm all for that. I love that. Easiest possible way. Okay. So, the first thing about training people is many people don't understand the difference between personal and communal prayer. They don't get it. So significant work needs to be done in helping them to understand the difference. Yep. And in leading prayer, what we do is we've got to take time to prepare. So that's another given. And maybe this is, maybe you all know this and you take it for granted that everybody else knows it. You know, one of those kind of secrets that you're going to lead somebody, you don't just stand up there and start doing your thing. You've got to prepare for it. Okay. So that has to be said out loud. Any kind of experience of communal prayer needs to be positive, and it needs to be non-threatening. So that then points to something around environment and the environment that you set up for prayer. Prayer doesn't just happen. You have to set up an environment for it to happen. Okay. And in regard to lay people, it's a really helpful thing initially if you're just beginning that two people prepare and lead together, because there's something very supportive about that. There's something very kind of, strengthening about that, because if I forget something, my partner is going to help me to remember, and so on. And then the easiest way into prayer, quickly in a communal setting, is to start with very straightforward prayer. Not to do anything very complicated, but something very straightforward that is easy for people to connect to. And it helps, obviously, to focus on a text. But if the text is too wordy or too heavy, then it's not going to be accessible for people. So even thinking around what you would use for text, be it the Word of God, be it the sayings of Paul of the Cross, be it any kind of, thing like that. And then, very, very important that there is brief silence or perhaps spontaneous prayer shared. And of course, that leads all into the whole notion of those who are leading prayer have to be comfortable with quietness and silence, and not doing that thing of constantly looking at their watch, agitated and all that kind of stuff. That's a learning, and it's a learning that needs to be achieved to lead communal prayer really well. Okay, so that's the building block of thinking about this. So it's beginning to maybe give you an idea of what these prayer guides might do. In my imagination, these prayer guides are reading communal prayer. Okay, it does really help if, in thinking about environment, that we create a focal point or a prayer space. That is really helpful. But, that's also a learning. We need to learn how to do that. And the setting of the prayer is really critical. The mood and the atmosphere are very important. Even lighting, heating. Have you noticed how warm this room is? All week I have. Heating, and people fall asleep, don't they, when things become silent and the room's too warm. Yeah? People fall asleep. So heating, lighting, seating arrangements, the way that that's all, it's not haphazard, it's intentional, it's helping people to feel at ease. And the focal point is not about doing something nice. It's not, here's a show and tell and I'm really great at setting up environments. It's about creating a space where people begin to realize they're gathered in the presence of the Lord. That the Lord is among us and with us. He's here in this space. And it can be a simple candle placed in a cloth in the middle of the group. It can connect with the colour of the year, perhaps. Or there might be a symbol that's relating to a chosen prayer passage. You see in this one that there's a cross there that was made of twigs, so that whatever that experience was interesting. But there's a prayer bowl there where people have written their own intercessions, and they have put the intercessions in that bowl. You know, they've said them out loud, but it's been held now and in that space. Okay. So that's just environment. Then moving on to the actual prayer itself and imagining what that might look like. Because we have to imagine it. If we're guiding others in prayers, we have to imagine what it might look like. Now, the Holy Spirit might get in there and do something in the middle of the prayer, but we have to do something that just helps people to kind of settle in. So here's a suggestion for the prayer guide, that the first words spoken by the leader are key to setting the tone for what's to follow. And the setting of that tone is really, really critical, in fact, because it's not, as they say in Ireland, an old chat. You've heard that phrase. It's not of like, how are you this morning? It's connecting straight into the fact that God is present. So suggestions that we gather together in God's presence, that's a nice, easy one to start us off. We come together to listen to God's word, another one to start us off, very simply. We take time to become aware of God with us. So those are easy entry points in to introduce the prayer. Music can enhance the prayer experience, but we'll talk about that in a minute. It can support the theme, perhaps, of the prayer and help people to enter into a time of reflection. There is a problem with music, because if you ain't very musical, you might actually pick something that disturbs and doesn't able, you know, like, so for example, the kind of music that we would use when we're training people is, you've heard of Ludovico Einaudi? Heard of him? Yeah? Have you heard of him? Einaudi? Anyway, he's got lovely, paced, meditative music. And look what I'm doing with my hands. Yeah, the music is repetitive and it moves you into a quiet, still place. Yeah? Yeah. So the choice of music is really, really important and critical. Now, with young people, you might want to do praise and worship, but when do you help them to move into something that's, you know, deeper and stiller? Yeah. Okay, so it might be appropriate to play some music or slowly read the focus text on the prayer sheet if there is one. If there is one. That's another thing about these prayer experiences. Paper can get in the way. Paper can very much get in the way. You know, like I'm just going to talk about when we did, remember, Aidan, Paul Francis, we did the Lectio Divina evenings in Lent, you know, and we had a wee leaflet and we were sitting with young people, and but there comes a point when you're sitting that they start, like paper can get in the way. Yeah. Okay. So we're still on music. Yeah, instrumental music's better rather than wordy stuff. Definitely. Or singing together, but people often are not confident with that. Often not confident. And using a phone, yeah, as long as you have made sure that you're not going to get a call in the middle of the music. Yeah. Obviously, Taisy chants are good. They're helpful. And the great thing about the Taisy chant is it actually prays in you. That's what's really good about it. You know, you've got a repetitive sentence, and then after the prayer, 2 days later, you're standing at the bus stop and it comes back to you. And that's great. Slow piano music, that's another one. The instrumental of a hymn, yeah, that can all be good, okay? So that's important, the way that we begin. Then here's another one that is really critical, helping everyone to take their part. Like, in a group dynamic, there are always people who will want to share, and there will always be people who will be super quiet, but they actually might be the people with the deep insights. So anyway, it's a given then that you would give people a copy of the text. And that in taking your part, that you would share out prayers and readings, that the leader wouldn't hold everything for themselves. And that there's space, there's ample space allowed for spontaneous prayer, that people have the freedom within that space to do that. And that perhaps when there's spontaneous prayer, the leader has a simple response so that everyone can join in. Everyone can take their part. And then the other thing about text is it's very helpful because the prayer can be extended by taking it home. Okay, keep my eye on the time. And this is a big one, I think, for us to remember, and I know that there are people in this room that are very good at remembering this, that we need to remember that some people take part by being still and silent, just by listening. And that's their main way of taking part, and that's good. Okay. So then moving on, let's think about reading from scripture or a piece of reflection. It's important that when we're reading that we do it slowly and carefully and with plenty of time for pauses, and that we don't read it like the newspaper. Now, this is the kind of thing we do in training to help people realise this takes its time, and it must take its time, and it's important that we read carefully. Okay. And then movement and gesture is important. So you see there's a gesture there. You see that one where people are invited to just hold a holding cross. Now that's quite an experience. When we were doing the training in February before the pandemic, we had an experience of gathering around in small groups. There was a holding cross, and it was just passed around the group. And whilst they were holding the cross, they were asked what was their response. And the response might be that they want to say, and they just simply want to hold the cross. Lighting a candle, very important before we proclaim the word. Picking up and holding symbols, doing that in an easy way, in a free way, in a gracious way. Here's another thing that's really lovely in groups at the end, sharing a sign of peace or some kind of blessing gesture. Quiet time, yeah, that is just, I've been saying it and reinforcing it most of the morning, that the time of quiet is a really important, fruitful time. So we have to be aware that silence is very necessary sometimes, and critical really, to help people go deeper. And without that silence, if we just rush through an experience, which is a tendency sometimes when particularly people lead, then the prayer is weakened, in fact, because there's not that space for God to speak. So if we have no silence, how are we going to hear God speaking to us? And it's good to let the group know when there's going to be a time of silence so they feel comfortable with it. You know, that it just doesn't happen and people are sitting there thinking, what's happening now? What are we doing now? What's going on now? Okay, and then moving on to sharing and reflecting, which is quite, well, it can be quite sensitive. Some people sometimes in these dynamics feel pressed or pushed to share. So sharing should come very freely from members, and no one should feel that they're pressed or pushed to share. And the leader might invite sharing. There might be quite a poor response about that, but people will gradually over time begin to share with practice. And here's an issue around this. This isn't a one-off experience. This is hopefully a series of experiences that help people to grow in familiarity. Obviously, things like intercessions can be read by the leader or other members or prayed spontaneously. And there's always a way of holding it all together and concluding it together. Might be said by the leader, but it might not. Everyone might be invited to join and pray together. Often that's a great technique and a great help where there's a concluding prayer and everyone joins in together because there's that sense of unity. And the group might finish the prayer by making the sign of the cross and blessing each other. That's been very moving for people, you know, just making the sign of the cross on the forehead, the person beside you. People find that very moving. Okay. Yeah, we've got loads of time, and I'm not going to hold you for too long. So here's the thing that I've come to over the years: recipes matter. You know, that formats for lay people when gathering, these build confidence. They enable easy ways in, simple ways in. These recipes can be repeated so that they become familiar. And it's that Ignatian kind of principle of repetition and how repetition is really, really important. Working it together in pairs is very supportive. Building up music that can enhance, images speak, and over time this is an approach that can grow. And it's, as St. Paul of the Cross would say, he probably wouldn't say this, it's an easy way in. And I think that we've got to work hard to find the easiest possible ways when we're doing this kind of stuff. So I think that's me kind of finished for this morning. Maybe you'd want to get into wee groups and share and have a chat because we've loads of time, yeah? Maybe groups of 3 or 4, what's staying with you, what's striking you, and then we can have a chat.